So look, thanks for everybody for coming online tonight. It's great to have you all this evening. Obviously, this topic for us is a little bit different for Everall's group to be doing, a financial services firm, but it's part of our More Than Just the Numbers series, which we'll be doing across the 2022 calendar year. So, and we thought we'd start here with cybersecurity being the topic for the night. And there can be little doubt that cyber risks are becoming greater and greater for small businesses, and for some of us, it's a little bit too close to home. So we thought that in talking to our business owners and increasing awareness around best practice and, seeking advice in this space, that would be very pertinent to a very pertinent message. So we're delighted to have Aron Robertson from Strategic Group here this evening to share his insights into cyber issues and developments in this space. Strategic Group are experts in cyber security, and I'd just like to say a few words about them. Strategic Group started in 1989, so over 30 years ago. So they've been around. And since then, they've expanded across the country and expanded into a team of just on 50, I hear. So pretty decent effort. They're not your average break-fix IT provider. They're a true IT partner. They ensure that they understand the strategic plans of the business clients that they have, so that they can ensure the IT environment actually matches up to those goals and those growth plans. We can speak for that because we're a proud client of Strategic. So it's great to have Aron here. Aron's the Director of Business Development with Strategic Group. I couldn't get much more information on his bio without stalking him too much, and I thought that might be a cyber issue. So I'm just going to welcome him and hand over to him on behalf of the Everall's Group.
Thanks, Jason, and thank you everybody for joining and registering for the session. So I'm going to spend a bit of time today talking about, as Jason said, a pertinent topic in cybersecurity, and unfortunately it's something that's becoming more and more a prevalent issue for both your staff and at the board level. So today it's relatively high level. I tried not to be too technical about the kinds of topics that I'll talk about, but given that it's cybersecurity, some of this stuff does become a little bit technical. So if any of the concepts or anything that I talk about during the session today go straight over your head, feel free to ask some questions at the end. I think we've got some folks monitoring the chat, so we'll pick those up at the end. Else, I'm sure there's time for more talk after the session. So without further ado, I'm going to sort of jump into the session to give you guys a little bit overview of cybersecurity as a topic, and probably the key areas that any SMB should be looking at and should be thinking about. And so to start the session is the concept of cybersecurity is essentially a life cycle. Cybersecurity and the idea of cyber threat analysis and rectification isn't a switch. It's definitely not something that you can just solve. You can't just turn the problems off. And that's because of the nature of the threat being something that's evolving over time. So the bad guys that are trying to get access to data or money or influence with the businesses that they're targeting, they're changing their tactics all the time. They're investing time, energy, effort in adapting the kinds of threats that are out there to circumvent any level of cybersecurity that you may have. So this first slide, I think, is an important way of probably prefacing the overall idea of cybersecurity, that it is a process. The threat detection and the idea of looking for a threat, so in the purple area on the left-hand side, the monitoring and detection, that's probably the area where most people are most familiar. So, having an antivirus tool installed on your machine at home for personal users, or in a business, you would have some sort of suite of threat detection, maybe a firewall at the office, or antivirus and endpoint protection or spam protection installed to detect threats and to resolve them, is the area where most people have have got a good understanding. But that's really only the beginning of the journey around cybersecurity. So that monitoring and detection piece also starting to get into the forensic side of investigation when it comes to finding out where a threat may have come from or what the root cause of a threat might be. So being able to dive into the infrastructure that you may have, the systems that you use at a much more deeper level is becoming something that's definitely part of the puzzle. And to do that, needing the data from the various systems and tools and endpoints that your business might have. So that monitoring and detection piece is the stuff that most people are relatively familiar with. But the stuff that in the orange, as you sort of come around that may or may not be maybe as important, is that making sure that your business has got a real good understanding of the governance, the strategy and the guidance that you give to your staff and your clients about cybersecurity. So making sure the business has got clear policies and procedures and plans put in place that are addressing cybersecurity. So making sure that your operations manual, making sure that your team have a clear understanding of what would happen in the event of a breach or in the event of a problem happening. The more detailed those policies and procedures and plans are, the quicker in which you'll be able to respond and act. And a lot of these issues may be technical, but they also may be people related. So making sure that those policies and procedures are well communicated across the business and are clear and have been tested. Making sure that there's strong education and training in the business. And I've got some slides further on in the presentation talking about some metrics as to where cyber threats happen, but a lot of them, about 30 to 40% of the kinds of things that lead to a data breach or some sort of a break in your defenses come from human error. You know, they may be a phishing scam, or they may be somebody accidentally sending information to the wrong person or the wrong recipient. So ensuring that the business has got a clear strategy around education and training is key, and almost as important as having those, you know, antivirus, anti-spam tools installed, is making sure that the staff have a good understanding about what cybersecurity is and what sorts of threats they should be looking at. And then to sort of round off that governance and compliance side of things is making sure that you have, you know, risk registers and compliance management to make sure that the staff are actually following the policies. That it's all well and good to have policies and procedures put in place, but having, you know, some level of controls around that to make sure that staff are following those policies and procedures is super important. And having a risk register, because over time, you may not have the money or the manpower to plug every single hole that you would like to in the business. But having that register there means that you've got a plan or a strategy to attack each one of those vulnerabilities. And that sort of dovetails into the section in green towards the bottom there, where you've got testing and assessment. So what goes on that risk register, what goes on your list of compliance, and having essentially an IT provider or someone inside the business who's responsible for doing things like vulnerability assessments. So trying to assess inside the business where all those risks might be, where you may have some problems, even going to the extent of doing things like penetration testing. Depending on what sort of business and what sort of infrastructure you have, penetration testing might be relevant, or even social engineering, which is essentially trying to maybe fish some credentials from your staff, or calling into your front desk and seeing if we can get access to security information or the ability to get into your business. So that testing and assessment allows your business to get a sort of a 360 view of whether or not you have risks and whether or not those risks are real or need to be plugged or whatnot. So I think this sort of opening slide just sort of shows that it's not just technology, it's not just having a good IT provider to keep yourself safe. While that is a key component of making sure your infrastructure is safe, a lot of this comes down to training and understanding of policies and procedures, as well as actually testing to see if you do have any threats within your business. So with that in mind, I thought I'd sort of cover off some of the key resilience tactics that you can put in place that essentially any SMB should be focused on addressing to make sure you're staying safe. Now, this is obviously not an exhaustive list, but it's a good place to start. It's a good place to have a think about how your business is set up and whether or not you've got a strategy in place for these sorts of things. So on the top left, the first one that pops up in pretty much any cyber insurance audit, and it is one of the sort of the best ways, at least keeping credentials safe, is making sure you have multi-factor authentication enabled everywhere you possibly can. So be it banking sites, the remote sessions that you're using, any virtual private networks you're connecting to, essentially making sure you've got that multiple factor of authentication. Maybe it's an authenticator app on your phone, or a physical key, or something like Windows Hello where you're using biometrics, but making sure that wherever you're using a password, you've also got that second factor of, or second or third factor of security, because unfortunately, gaining access to credentials is relatively easy, and that's where the bad guys spend a lot of their time going for, because once you've accessed the password and the username for a user, you can go directly into systems. You don't have to try and break through security defenses, which are very difficult to get through. It's much easier to get access to the keys to the car and drive the car away than try and steal the car, if you can sort of think about that. And with something like multi-factor, even if your credentials have been lost for some reason, you might have accidentally given your password or your email address away, if the threat actor doesn't have access to the multi-factor, that will keep you safe. Unfortunately, multi-factor isn't perfect, because there are ways to get through multi-factor, but it definitely does give you a much greater level of security. In some cases, using a virtual private network, so keeping your data encrypted is also an area that should be, especially for businesses, something that you think about, making sure that when you are working with secure systems, or you're transferring data between systems, that you're using a virtual private network, which essentially encrypts the traffic between systems, to make sure that if anybody else is listening to the network or trying to get access to that information, they won't be able to, because the information is going to be encrypted. There are multiple layers and multiple ways of establishing a virtual private network, but depending on the use case, having some sort of VPN technology is definitely an area that you want to have a think about. Also, depending on what your systems are, having some sort of remote desktop or virtual desktop solution is also an area to keep your users safe. So having essentially a secure virtual desktop that your staff or you use on a daily basis keeps all of your data, all of your systems, all of your applications in one centrally managed spot. And from an IT perspective, it can be a very robust way of keeping control over who can access systems and who can access data. So depending on the architecture and the tools and technology that you've got in your software stack, or the kinds of applications you use in your business, having something like a remote desktop protocol may be exactly what you need. As we mentioned in the first slide, ensuring that you've got endpoint protection and response tools installed on every endpoint. So an endpoint can be as much as just your laptop, but it can also be the servers or mobile phones, or any endpoint, be it a firewall across the business. So making sure that we've got valid antivirus, anti-spam tools installed is a good way to detect and respond to threats. These modern tools as well are also gathering telemetry, which is very important for us. Things like, making sure that the inbound connection request to a server is coming from the right country, or from a different time zone. We can lock those things down, and we can use these tools to essentially control who has access to what, and look for behaviors that might be different. So not just having a look at, say, a specific file that might be coming in. We want to look at the time, the date, where that file's come from. So these tools are getting much more sophisticated, because we need to be more sophisticated in the way we sort of monitor networks and monitor files and monitor the way information is being shared amongst yourself and the folks that you work with. Making sure you've got a clear incident response plan. So unfortunately, things happen, and in some cases, you may lose data, or the bad guys may get access to credentials and get into systems. But having a clear incident response plan ready to go means that when you do have something happen, you've got a clear understanding of what those next steps are. And the metrics show us that the faster at which you can jump on a cybersecurity incident, definitely the least you can lessen the impact and lessen the cost to your business, because you're essentially being able to rectify or mitigate situations as quickly as possible. And especially from a communications standpoint, it's good to be able to communicate with your affected people or the affected companies that you're working with in an incident. So having a clear incident response plan is super important, because these tools and technologies that you have, as well as the people that are using them, are fallible, and these sorts of things can happen. So having a clear plan is super important. Infrastructure segmentation, again, this is somewhat more IT centric or a little bit more sophisticated, but essentially making sure that if a person is able to get into your systems, there's a term essentially called the blast radius, or the impact of having somebody lose their credentials. So infrastructure and segmentation, making sure that if somebody does get into your systems, that they're only able to get to the minimum number of files or the minimum number of applications. So in the old world, I think folks tried to make sure that everybody had access to everything. It made things nice and simple. In the new world, essentially you want to make sure that your staff have access to the least amount of files, the least amount of applications that they possibly could, just in case if they were able to lose their credentials, that you're minimizing the impact that that's going to have on the wider business. So having to think about segmentation in access to files, permissions on applications, permissions on access to certain systems, having control over the time and whatnot is super important. A pretty obvious one is backups, and making sure that your firm has a clear backup strategy, and making sure that those backups are tested on a regular basis. So it's all well and good to make sure that your files are being backed up, but if you're not checking that they're actually being backed up and that those files are being able to be restored, you're generally going to get yourself into trouble. And also making sure that those backups are stored in multiple areas, so not just backed up to, say, maybe the same device. They might be backed up to the cloud, or they may be backed up to the cloud and to a tape library. So the more layers of backup that you have, the more likely you are able to recover from an incident, as well as the more regular you back up, the less likely you're going to be losing any work in progress and whatnot. Access control, so similar to infrastructure segmentation, controlling who has access to systems and monitoring that access to systems, both for while people are with your business, but I think importantly with access control as you're onboarding or offboarding staff, making sure that there's a simple way to add new staff to your business and give them access to systems. But equally, if somebody was to exit your business, making sure you've got an easy and simple way to lock off access to systems, and you've got a policy and procedure around that. We talked about the security training culture in your business, making sure you've got that, and that can be one of the best resilience tactics that you have. You know, if a spam message goes around or a phishing message goes around, and knowing that the staff are talking to each other about cybersecurity issues, the less likely those sorts of things are going to happen. And lastly, the email hygiene. Making sure that staff understand that email is not a secure way to share files. It's not a secure way to communicate with people. It is a fast and easy way, and fast and easy doesn't really equal security. So making sure that they're monitoring the kinds of emails coming in, the requests that they have, and looking out for anything that might be aberrant. You know, somebody asking for a quick change to a bank account, obviously having policies and procedures around handling those sorts of requests properly, and not just trusting an email, making a phone call. You know, if there's any risk that something could happen because of the request and an email, or if there's any sort of rush, usually that's a red flag to look out, especially if you've never seen that sort of request before. If somebody's asking for a password change or access to systems like you may never have had before, looking out for those sorts of things down the track. So that's sort of the high level, resilience tactics, things you want to have a think about as those sorts of low-hanging fruit. There's definitely many more areas to look at when it comes to cybersecurity, and that kind of brings me on to my next level. And this is something that I think is going to become more prevalent in Australian businesses. It's already something that European and folks in North America have to deal with. So in North America, there's a framework called NIST, and in Europe, the GDPR is essentially the two main frameworks that most businesses of any reasonable size need to adhere to be able to trade there. In Australia, we've got the Privacy Act, but we don't have anything that's essentially really telling businesses that they have to adhere to a certain set of guidelines. But there are international guidelines around governance and risk and compliance that can help you essentially get to the bottom of every single part of your business that may need to be reviewed. So that first slide had, I think it was around 8 to 10 areas you might want to have a look at. But the reality of cybersecurity is that it's significantly more complicated than that. And using tools like the ISO certification around 7001, or even the Essential 8, which has been brought out by the Australian government, the ACSC, are a couple of good areas to sort of have a look at where you can unpack a lot more of your business. So the ISO certification has got 16 areas, or 18 areas, sorry, and about 170 or 180 different controls in that ISO framework that will go through your business and have a look at all sorts of areas of cybersecurity and information security management that will allow you to get to the bottom of things like the human resources security, cryptography within your business, what's being encrypted, communication security, how are you communicating between yourselves inside the business, inside a threat when things are happening. And it really can unpack quite a lot, but it's quite a big undertaking. So it depends on how complicated your business is and what kind of appetite you have for risk. But something like the ISO certification around 27001 can really help your business get to the bottom of every single threat, and then over time allow you to manage that. So that's a good area to start. But equally, the Essential 8. So I think we'll probably share this presentation and some of the links that are in there. But this slide, if you follow the link that pops up for that image there on the right-hand side, will take you through to the Essential 8 maturity model, which is a really good place to start to have a think through that. So, obviously we'd love to help you with these sorts of things, but even if you have an IT provider already, making sure that they've sort of looked through this at the very least, and are sort of managing your IT systems and processes and tools at the very least to the Essential 8 maturity model. But depending on what sort of business you have, and if you have critical information or critical systems that you're protecting, something like ISO might be an area that you might want to drill into and get to the bottom of it. But it is quite a big undertaking for you to sort of to go with. Unfortunately, things do happen as well. So for those businesses that are sort of watching this presentation now, many of you will be large enough to be included in the notifiable data breaches scheme, which is sort of an extension of the Privacy Act. And depending on the sort of the nature of a breach that you have, it may be you may be legally bound to report that breach to the Privacy Ombudsman, and it's usually around the level of harm that kind of breach could have. So that could be financial harm or physical or psychological harm, and it can be for one person or many people. So it doesn't have to be the big kinds of breaches that you hear on the nightly news. Essentially, if the information that's been lost or the breach has happened could result in harm for a business or an organisation, there may be a need for you to disclose that to the Privacy Ombudsman. It's generally around, and you can see on the left-hand side there, the top 5 industries that are having to breach or having to notify health service providers because of health records and health information. When that sort of information is being lost, it's definitely a high area of threat. Finance information, because essentially getting access to banking information or superannuation information or credit card information in finance, those sorts of businesses are having to report quite a lot. Legal, accounting, management services sort of followed behind that. The Australian government have managed to make the top 5 list in the last 12 months that have definitely had breaches where they've had to report those breaches, and insurance companies, again, because insurance providers have a lot of information, a lot of personal information, credit card information and whatnot. So depending on your size of your business, it's probably worth having a look at this. So if you've not heard about this before, or it's the first time you've heard about it, I'll put a link in here as well so you can have a quick read of the report. It's got a bit of information around the Privacy Act and the Notifiable Data Breaches Scheme and those sorts of things. A bit of bedtime reading for everybody, but it's worth having a look. I think the more important thing on the side of this slide is also where the source of those breaches are. So while malicious or criminal attack makes up a large proportion of this, so things like phishing for credentials or the bad guys getting access to information, system fault is usually one of the smallest areas. So about 5% of the breaches that have happened in Australia in the last 12 months that have been notified have been for system fault, because it's a lot harder for the bad guys to go through the technology that's been put in place by IT providers. It's much easier for them to go through essentially phishing credentials and whatnot. But also 30% of those breaches has been simple human error. So people accidentally sending information to the wrong person, or they're emailing information that they shouldn't have. And those security breaches, cybersecurity breaches are heavily impactful, which is why the amount of time and energy that you should be spending with your staff around training and an understanding of what their role in cybersecurity is super important, because it simply is one of the biggest areas that causes these sorts of breaches. So I think on the bottom there, you've got sort of the top causes of those human breaches. So basically sending personal information to the wrong recipient, failure to use the BCC when sending emails. So essentially sharing emails that you didn't have the right to share, unintended release or publication of information. So sharing information to people either at the wrong time or in the wrong manner, or essentially sending personal information by other means. So in that case, it can be just losing physical information as well. So it doesn't always have to be via email. If information is being posted to the wrong person, or it's accidentally being left or lost, and these sorts of things also extend to physical equipment. So if you lost a laptop, for instance, that had information on it that was sensitive in any way, the fact that laptop has been lost may in itself be something that you need to be able to report, because it does have sensitive information in it, and you don't know where that is. So when we think about these sorts of things, it's not always just email or the bad guys getting in and doing their things. It can be the fact that information has been lost or accidentally misplaced, and then an assessment needs to happen. So if you do follow that link in this presentation, it'll give you a lot of information. The Australian government's put a lot of information around how to handle a notifiable data breach. So there's a lot more further reading there, and we've got a couple of more information that you might want to get your hands on as well for that. I think one thing also to pay close attention to is that you definitely need to have a clear level of cyber insurance that would wrap around the things we're talking about today, because things will happen, and making sure that you have the right level of cyber insurance policies in place is key to being able to get through a scenario like this. That I think the latest sort of metrics around the costs to a business around a cyber breach in Australia is nearly $500,000. So an incident or a large incident to your business can be extremely impactful, and these sorts of ransomware or hack attacks are happening quite regularly. So making sure that you do take into account that as long as your personal indemnity insurance and your cyber insurance is up to date, that you have some level of cover for your business. And so I thought I'd put in here a little bit, because I think when people talk about cyber insurance, they're not entirely sure what it is. And Strategic Group, we're not an insurance company, and this is definitely not advice, but a basic cyber insurance policy should cover you for a couple of key things. So that sort of first party cover, the break glass around crisis management, and that can include essentially immediate costs that your business may have for any sort of cyber breach. So that can include any expenses you might have notifying your clients about a breach. So marketing, getting a marketing team involved, depending on the size of your business, working on PR and how that's going to affect the brand. You may need to, you may only have a very small marketing team and not be ready to do something like this. So crisis management expenses that happen essentially at the moment that a breach has happened is very important, because things like your professional indemnity insurance may only pay out after a criminal case has gone through. So you may not be able to get access to those funds until way after an incident has happened. Whereas cyber insurance is there almost like the rental car when your car breaks down. It's something that you can get access to straight away. Bringing in a forensic IT team, like maybe Strategic Group, to come in and have a look at what has happened inside the business. And also monitoring any credit, banking, doing the forensic analysis on where information or funds may have gone. There may be data recovery expenses. So once something has happened, how are you getting access to replacing or restoring or recollecting that data? And when we talk about data, that also may be the work in progress. So let's say, for instance, your business has been attacked by somebody and your information has been cryptoed, it's been locked up, and you didn't have the relevant backup procedures put in place, or for some reason it's taking a long time for that information to come back. The cyber insurance in some cases can also cover the work in progress that your staff have lost because of the incident. So trying to bring that data back into the business is not just the copy and paste of bringing the data back in. It may also extend to the rework that's required to regenerate some of that data. Which also sort of leads to that business interruption expenses. So the loss of income because of the cyber event, that your business may be down for several days or weeks while you rectify, and what impact does that have on your immediate cash flow? So having something like cyber insurance, and depending on the policy that you do choose, provides you a bit of cover and control around those lost expenses. And then data extortion costs again. So in some cases, cyber insurance cover will cover paying ransomware and those sorts of events. I think most insurance policies will have some provisioning for handling those sorts of issues, but it only usually works, around 50% of the time, that if the crypto virus has gone through and you do pay the fine or pay the ransom, it's very rare that it actually works. So it does work sometimes, and in some cases it's the only way to get the data back, and it can be a more efficient way of bringing systems back up because it's just quicker, but it doesn't always work. And then also those third-party coverage, so things like security and privacy liabilities. So any claims that you may have against third parties or downstream claimants, regulatory costs and fines. So if there, for some reason, that this cyber event has caused your business to require a fine or a penalty or some things like that, the cyber insurance can cover those sorts of things. And then multimedia liability, so any copyright claims or libel or slander types of claims. So making sure that you've got a clear or an up-to-date policy around cyber insurance really is very important. And the policies and procedures, the policies that are connected to cyber insurance are increasing. I think it's a significantly growing market inside the insurance sector, and I think it's something that if you don't already have a level of cyber insurance, it's something you should look at, but also making sure that policy itself can be claimed against, because unfortunately we've seen quite often that the cyber insurance policies out there will have quite a few caveats and things in the policy that make it very hard to claim against. So, maybe there's been a persistent threat inside your business over a period of time that's made it harder for you to claim against that policy. So making sure you have a real clear understanding of not only what is covered, it's what sort of things are excluded, or what types of events will exclude you from being able to claim. So you don't want to get in a situation where you feel like you've got adequate cover, except when the incident happens, you're essentially being declined a claim because of certain circumstances that might be in the policy that you weren't aware of. Now, as I mentioned, that from a cybersecurity standpoint, having an idea that these things will happen, or there may be issues that in your business that will be impactful, having a good understanding around business continuity. So making sure that you've got a plan in place that means that while you may have an incident that takes your systems down or stops your business being able to run for a period of time, maybe hours, days, weeks, or months, you've got a business continuity plan in place that explains how you're going to handle that sort of scenario. So we've got an ebook that I think you can download and have a quick read through as well, which we'd love to share for free. Just have a quick read through. It sort of unpacks that little circle we've got on the left there. So how to essentially put in place some clear business continuity planning. So obviously starting with a bit of information gathering around the business. What are your risks? What are you trying to achieve? Then moving on to a business impact analysis. So that essentially looks at all of the areas of your business that could be impacted. What are the things that you're protecting? What are your financial liabilities? What kind of data are you holding? Is it tax file information? Is it credit card information? Is it personal information? All of that sort of thing, like having a look inside the business in depth. Then coming to essentially building a disaster recovery plan. So once, if a disaster happens, depending on the type of disaster, having a clear plan that says, this has happened and this is what we do in the event of that, and having a good understanding about what your timeframes are around disaster and rectifying a disaster. Finalising and storing that is very important, because once you've come up with this sort of business impact analysis and then you've got your plan in place, making sure that that's in a place that you can get to. Having your business continuity plan only stored inside the systems that might then get cryptoed and locked up isn't particularly helpful, given that you now don't have access to those systems. So making sure that that place is accessible in multiple ways and by multiple people in the event of an issue is a very important part of the process of business continuity planning. Almost as important as the test and review phase. Time and time again, we work with businesses that have some level of a business continuity plan or a disaster recovery plan as part of their ops manual, but that's not being tested. They've never tested it. They've never walked through that with their businesses, their business partners and staff. And when an incident happens, they're scurrying to find the business continuity plan or the disaster recovery plan, and all the dates are wrong, all the contact details are wrong. It's so out of date that no one's even had a look at it, and it's actually causes more harm than good. So making sure that on a regular basis, you're running essentially what they call fire drills to test these sorts of systems, so that you've got these sorts of things in place. And sort of coming towards the end of the session, as I know I'm getting pretty close to time, staying informed. So we've put up a couple of additional resources here that you can have a look at. The ACSC puts out their annual cyber threat report once a year. This is the latest one that came out towards the end of last year. And you can click the link in the presentation to download that one, talking about the kinds of threats that Australian businesses are facing. It's a good read. There's quite a lot of information in there. We've run a couple of additional sort of deep dive sessions around, say, information security and breach handling, or a little bit more technical when it comes to cybersecurity best practices, or our blog. But really the message on this slide is to make sure that if you're a business owner and you're responsible for the safety of your business and the safety of your staff, staying informed on these issues really is a good way to get an understanding of what your risk appetite is, so you can put some policies and procedures and whatnot in place to cover that. So the last slide here, as we sort of get to towards the end of the presentation, is, I'd be more than happy to field any questions that you may have today, or even after the session, if you'd like to reach out and you have any questions specific to your business, or even personally, if you've had anything else, I'm more than happy to share hopefully some wisdom with you. So with that, I'll sort of wrap up here, and then maybe pass over to see if there's any questions from the group, or I'll wish you guys a good night, and we can wrap it up then. So I think, do we have any questions from the group?
Might have a shy bunch.
There we go. Just bringing the chat up.
Okay. No, that's all good.
All good. All right, guys. Everybody's a bit shy, but it is 6:15. on a Thursday. So
Yeah.
look, honestly, I really appreciate you listening to me sort of waffle on a little bit around cybersecurity. I'm pretty passionate about this sort of thing, and it is a pretty important thing to have a good understanding of. So if you do have any questions after the session, please feel free to reach out, and I'd be more than happy to have a chat.
Yeah, and thank you, Aaron, on behalf of us as well. That was fantastic, and look forward to having you present again to all of us on another topic or something
Sure.
like that. If there's any feedback in relation to any IT related topics or the like that people would love to know more about, pass that on, and we'll talk to the strategic guys if they can maybe put a topic together for us at a future date later in the year or next year, whenever. So thank you very much, Aaron.
Thanks, guys.